Well, this is going to be a lot of fun. This is our evidence-based triathlete episode, but also comes to the airways here through Las Vegas Tri Club and through University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and our Sports Research and Innovation Initiative. So there's lots of sort of worlds coming together on this one because of our guest, who we have the honor of having, Dr. Stacy Sims, on this episode. Welcome, Stacy. How are you?
Oh, thanks. I'm good. I'm good.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm excited and looking forward to this. It'll be fun.
Well,
Awesome.
and Stacy is in New Zealand right now, so we're on a little bit different time zone. I think you're in R tomorrow, right? Is that how it?
Yep.
I
I'm
always have to look it up.
yeah, I'm future girl and the world is still here, so it's all good.
Well, and I know a lot of our audience is familiar with you, but at the same time, it is important for them to know that you are a world-renowned expert in exercise physiology and nutrition, and your influence in the area of the female athlete has just been tremendous. You specialize in the sex differences of men and women in thermoregulation, nutrition, and exercise performance. And you've written a book called Roar, and you've really coined the phrase and well known for women are not small men, and you've addressed issues specific to women in exercise. And the other area that I think of that you work in is in the hormonal health area, and you're also known as the period women. Where you talk about menstrual cycle and not only influence of training, but also for our world, in the academic world, in terms of doing research.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a lot of fun talking with you about not only application of research, but also how to do good research involving women. That's actually a neat story. I reached out to you recently because you appeared, you were quoted in an article on in Outside Online about the lack of representation of females in research studies. And
Totally. Yeah.
yeah, a colleague of mine, Dr. Nancy Lowe, who's part of our Sports Research Innovation Initiative, co-director, she actually emailed that article to me, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is great. And I know Stacy Sims. I don't know her, but I know her through podcasts and the work and what my wife has done the course with you on. And I said, I got to reach out to her. And so I emailed
Perfect.
you, and within like 15 minutes, you responded and said, no, I'd love to get together with you. And I was like, I was blown away. So I know you do a lot of these and you're very engaged with the community, and it's great to have you. So thank you.
You caught me on the day where I was actually in front of my computer.
Awesome.
Online in front of my computer. But no, seriously, like I followed you guys and I was like, oh, this will be super fun. It'll be
Oh,
good. Yeah.
that's
Awesome.
great. Well, I'm going to turn the mic over to Ted to get us started on
Yeah.
the direction we're going to go here.
So I guess the first thing is to give us a little bit of more background on you. So my first question, always when we talk about to academia or academics, is what made you go down this crazy pathway into academics?
I think I don't know actually. I never planned anything. Um, so when I graduated from undergrad, I was laughing because I won the outstanding senior student in kinesiology, and at that award ceremony, they're saying, "So what are you going to do?" And everyone else at the award ceremony said, "Oh, I'm going here. I'm doing this." They had their plan, and I go, "I don't know. I'm going to move to San Francisco and see what happens." And I actually didn't end up moving into San Francisco. I ended up getting into a graduate program at Springfield College, um, partly because of that drive that started at Purdue about looking at sex differences. I still wanted to get into that. And the opportunity came up to go to Springfield and do my master's and look at overtraining in endurance athletes
Hmm.
and really see what the differences were between men and women. And then after that, I was like, I'm not ever doing any more academia. I got
Yeah.
out and worked, moved down to New Zealand, was working here, and then opportunity came up to look at heat or altitude research, but at the very bottom of the world at Otago. And I was like, oh, that sounds like a cool thing to do. And emailed back and forth to George Brooks going, what's the difference between getting a PhD in the States and getting one down here? Because there are differences in the programs. He's like, basically, it comes down if you're smart and you can publish and you have a voice and you have something you want to push out. I was like, okay. So then, yeah, so that was kind of like everything kind of fell into place without a real plan, except for the underlying drive to answer these questions of why women are put in the same box as men when they shouldn't be.
Yeah. And I think, you know, having read some of your stuff and listened to you before, a lot of it comes from your own personal life, right? Like your struggles personally,
Yeah,
and obviously the people that you've mentored along the way.
yeah. Um, I will preface that almost everything I try to answer in the lab comes from a selfish question.
Yeah.
Like I want to know answers for myself. I think a lot of us might be that way. So yeah, I mean, it started when I was on the rowing team at Purdue, and we were training like the lightweight women were training like the lightweight men, but we were having differences in responses. We weren't peaking at the same time, so there were a lot of things that weren't making sense. And that was the same time where coming from San Francisco, asking questions all the time and asking those questions in the lab and not getting those answers. So that was like the driving force. And now retrospectively, if you think about it, the three of us have probably had those students who are always asking why. And you're like, what do you mean? Why are you asking why? Just listen, right?
Yeah.
But I was that student, right? And now I look back and I was like, wow, they actually answered questions or allowed us to try to figure it out, which is unusual. So yeah, that was the start of it. And then when I got to Kona, wondering why those of us in the high hormone phase had problems with hyponatremia, and those in the low hormone phase didn't, even though we did the same kind of heat training and everything to get there. So there are a lot of things that kept coming up in my personal endeavors that I really wanted to answer in the lab.
Aren't those the best way, the best impetus for learning though? You know,
Yeah.
I'm an athletic trainer, and I contend that every time I get injured, I become an expert in that area. Like,
Yeah.
And I love, like, I don't get me wrong, I hate being injured, but I love to learn, right? And you always learn more when it's real, right?
Right.
Or for you, it's even when you have a client, right? Because I do some coaching, and it's the same thing. When I have a client who has an issue, it's a real thing rather than just some nebulous statistic in a book somewhere.
Exactly, exactly. And I mean, that's also what's pushed me to really figure out how to identify and help female athletes with low energy availability and red S. Because I work with a lot of female athletes who have professional contracts and can't do the recommended just stop and gain weight.
Yeah.
One, that's not going to work because people really won't follow that. But two, if it's your job, you can't do that because that's your livelihood. So trying to walk that fine line between health and performance and find success in that, it's also a really interesting like drive for me as well.
Well, and I know we want to get to some of the messages that you have, which are really spot on. But I'm curious as to at what point did you realize that there was not good science to answer some of the questions that you were asking, in terms of the female athlete?
I think every time I have a question, I find that out. Seriously. It's starting to get better in the past about 4 years because there's been more of a globalization and an awareness. And those of us who've kind of been in that whole female athlete space are now getting higher up and have
Mhm.
editorial positions in journals and looking at methodology. But you could pretty much take every study in the sports science world and look at it and say it's not applicable to women. We need to redo it.
Yeah, I think the article that you were quoted in, I think they were talking about, 3% of the subjects are female. If
Yep.
they do this big, analysis of all the research out there, and that is really amazing that it's that low. But I mean, and you wrote a paper on this. What are some of the reasons as to why we've had this gap in the female as a research subject?
So it's more of a sociocultural aspect rather than an intentional. So if we look at like just the history of women in society, we've always been marginalized. We've been told that we're delicate flowers and we can't do anything hard on our period, and we're not as strong as men. And you think about even Catherine Switzer when she was training for the boss and all of her notorious comments and stories that come out. So she was training with her best friend who was a guy and was doing the same distance and the same training and successful. But yet when it came down to the race, she wasn't allowed to because she was a delicate woman until they found her in the race, right? So it's all these marginalization things, and it's not just in sports science and society, it's in all biomedical research. Like the cellular research is done on male rat cells, right? So you're looking at, it's just endemic. So when you start looking at why have women been excluded, part of it is that male lens in research and the patriarchy that kind of dominates Western society and Western medicine. And then you also have just the default of what's appropriate. So the default is the cis male for almost all models. And if that's the default, then that's where people gravitate to. And so when a woman is going, well, how does this apply to me? They're like, well, you can come into our study, and she might not necessarily feel that comfortable. So there's lack of a push for participation and a lack of awareness for participation. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. It's the way the whole system has evolved and the way that women have been treated within the system.
Mhm.
And again, it's changing, which is fantastic. But historically, it's been driven from that male lens and that male dominance, which is very exclusionary.
Mhm. Oh, that's a great point, and I think this is why it's so important to continue to bring more diversity in our PhD programs to generate more researchers that look like lots of different people, and because then they ask, like you, questions that are selfish, that we want to know about ourselves, and I think that's really important.
Yeah. And I sit here and talk about female athletes, but I'm a white woman, right? But there are so many different
Mhm.
ethnical variations that we also need to investigate and see. And like, I want my PhD students who are diverse to ask those questions and challenge me on those and call me out on things that might just be in the white dominated vision.
Mhm.
But like you say, the more variety we have and the more diversity we have, the better the science becomes.
So that being said, when you recruit your students, do you do something in particular special to do you look at it through a lens of diversity?
I actually don't recruit students because
Okay.
of the fact that we have a different system than what is in the States, right? So we have a 3-year program, and people will email and say, I'm interested in this particular area. A lot of it has to do with female athlete, hormone, that kind of stuff. So it's really just the area and whoever comes in. And one of my really close colleagues here is a fantastic sociologist in female athletes. So our pool of PhD students ends up being super diverse, partly because of the topic, but also because we're very close to the other side of the Pacific Rim. So we have a lot of Pacific Islanders that come in. We have a lot of people from Vietnam and Samoa. So the diversity just comes up just from the nature of being down in the Southern Hemisphere.
Right. So, this is maybe more of a global question. So I agree with you that a lot of the research needs to be redone.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the seminal research. So if you could choose one thing, what would it be to redo out of all these seminal
I know.
and some of the bigger things, the bigger conclusions we've come across? Do you have one that you're like, oh my gosh, I just wish someone would do this, even though it's going to be expensive and it's going to take a lot of time? Do you have one?
I have 2 big ones
Okay,
that I would really like to
I'm
do.
taking notes.
Okay, taking notes. So the big one that I want to do, because I get pushback a lot, is phase-based training. So
Yep.
looking both strength and aerobic, anaerobic phase-based training. Because you can do systematic review, but all the methodologies within those papers are so confusing that you really don't find that many differences until you look specifically at the papers. And there's so many people out there from the globalization of the Dr. Google, they're like, hey, where's that randomized controlled trial? And so that's one big one. And then the other really has to do with carbohydrate metabolism, because then that, to me, will also go after all of these trendy diets that are not that helpful for women. So we're looking at the low carb, high fat, the ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting. And if we had more of a handle of sex differences and carbohydrate metabolism, I think that would also really help get the story correct that women need more carbohydrate than men just to exist because of endocrine function. So there's a whole bunch of little studies that you could redo within that, but just doing a major sex difference in carbohydrate metabolism during exercise and at rest, and also looking at sleep and carbohydrate metabolism as one big 24 or longer hour study, I think would be really amazing.
Yeah, I agree. It's so interesting how the pendulum swings back and forth on macronutrients. And 3 or 4 years ago, the low carbohydrate really had its big heyday. And it got to
I
a point
know.
where you couldn't read an article and you couldn't, listen to a podcast, then they weren't talking about it. And I just got so sick of it. As an endurance athlete, to me, it never made sense.
Right.
And as a female, people, females that I'm working with, it never made sense, especially never made sense, but they were indoctrinated into this, and it was ingrained in that everyone's doing it, so you have to do it.
I
And
know.
I'm still fighting the battle, right?
Me too. Me
And
too.
but I think we will get past it, right? So we've won the battle, I think, with NSAIDs. I think.
Fingers
Fingers
crossed.
crossed. We're winning the battle, I think, with cryotherapy in my world, and which has taken forever. We won the battle on static stretching.
Yes.
Right. So maybe this is the next battle that we can, as sports scientists, we can win.
Hopefully. I've got a couple of cool studies going with the continuous glucose monitoring stuff with normal blood glucose monitoring and measuring in female endurance athletes. So that might be one step. But the biggest thing about it is we're finding that those women who are in a low energy state have severe hypoglycemic aspects at night, which perturbs their sleep. And they're thinking, oh, I'm just having poor sleep and I'm not recovering well because of poor sleep. But it's like, well, actually, if you bring carbohydrate intake up and food density up and prevent that hypoglycemia, sleep comes out better.
Yeah, I've noticed this with some of the elite athletes here that I've talked to, and in females in particular, and they're saying, I want to sleep. I know I need to sleep, but I'm waking up and I cannot get back to sleep and I'm hungry. And I'm like, okay, let's look at this. What is your macronutrient breakdown and what kind of carbohydrates are you getting? And like, well, carbs are the enemy. And I'm like, you're a runner. They're not the enemy. And no, I think you're spot on with that. And we've known for a while, especially just low energy availability in general causes sleep issues. But I think it's even worse with our female athletes because of the added need of carbohydrates. So I'm so glad you all are doing that. That's fantastic. I can't wait to read that.
Yeah, it'll be a little bit because we were just recruiting.
Okay. So John and I both have actually worn continuous glucose monitors. And I think both of us, our eyes were really open to just, what our responses were. And especially when I was in some times of low energy availability and seeing that in the middle of the night, your blood glucose at 85, and it's like, well, that's a little bit lower than normal. And okay, why? And it's like, oh, I had a 4-hour bike ride and I obviously didn't refuel properly. So that's great.
I want to dive into this a little deeper, and Stacy, maybe even take us back a little bit in terms of what is low energy availability and how is it similar or different between men and women?
So the most layperson way of saying low energy availability is you're not eating enough to support your just lying on the couch watching Netflix. And then when you try to get up and do training, like your body is like, I don't have anything to give here. So you get into this hole and your body keeps wanting to go. So what it does is it shuts down the high energetic aspects of your endocrine system. So in women, we see luteinizing hormone pulse perturbations and then menstrual cycle dysfunction. In men, we see low testosterone. It's hard enough to get women to talk about menstrual cycle. So if you walk into a room and ask men how many people have low T or symptoms of low T, no one's going to raise their hand. So that's another conversation we need to keep pushing forward. And it's not just the total calorie. We're finding more and more it's about the timing of your food, because so many people now in these trendy diets, like they're doing fasted training, or their training comes in their fasted window, or they're doing their training fed, but then their fasted window comes after training. So they stay in this big catabolic state, and they might be eating enough calories, but at the wrong time. So if you're staying in that catabolic state around training, your body's still getting the signals that you don't have enough food coming in. So you still get the symptomology and the downward turn that you find with low energy availability.
Interesting. All right. So how does someone know that they're in a low energy availability state? And given that it's always going to change, or what is it, just a fatigue, or is it?
It's progressive. So a lot of people, like from an acute standpoint, and we're all in the endurance world, it's like you have a lighter out on a Friday and you might not feel that hungry. So, and you're also busy, and a light workout might be a swim. So you're not really thinking, oh, I need to refuel. So you're already starting the weekend low. And then you have your long ride and maybe a brick session, right? And then your long run on a Sunday. And with those, you have a muted of your appetite. So on Monday, it's another light session. You're already in the hole by thousands of calories, right? And then you just keep rolling forward with your week. So you get this progressive state of not eating enough. And yeah, it's the dead end fatigue. But after about 2 to 3 weeks, you'll really start to notice in your power wattage, right? You can't hit those intensities you want. You're trying to get up a hill and you're like, oh, maybe it's the training load that I've been under the past 3 weeks. I need to deload. But if you're not eating enough in that deload week, you're not going to come out of it. So the early warning signs is looking at really what is your performance metrics, what's going on. Again, you can layer your sleep in there. If you're having a lot of sleep disruptions and performances or sleep disruptions and poor performance in your sleeping, then that's another sign. As you guys have noted, like hypoglycemia while you're sleeping. So it's the early warning signs we're looking for. And then when you get further down the track, not only is it the flat performance and the inability to get up in the morning and the lack of mojo, but then you start putting on body fat and you're like, what's going on? Why? I'm training harder. And of course, the mentality, especially in endurance sports, is if you're putting on weight, you better train harder and eat less. So it becomes a cyclical thing, right? So we always like fuel for what you are doing, even if it is low intensity, because what you're doing today directly affects what you're doing tomorrow. So fuel in and around your training sessions to avoid getting into that low energy state.
Oh, I love it. So then maybe talk a little bit about how energy availability may change over the menstrual cycle, and then also with menopausal, post-menopausal women.
Yeah. And the thing with premenopausal women who have a natural cycle, like we say, having your period is an ergogenic aid, because if you start getting dysfunction and irregular periods or missed periods, then that's a sign that you need to pull back and really investigate, how is my nutrition and training working together? But when you get into perimenopause, because you have irregular cycles and you already have anxiety, depression, body composition changes, dead end fatigue, it's really hard to identify. So we try to look at the delta, and we're looking at how much are you putting out versus what are you putting in. So it's almost a daily, not necessarily macro tracking, but keeping track of how you're feeling and are you fueling appropriately for your workouts. So that will help keep people out of low energy availability. When you get into postmenopause, it's really difficult to identify because there is no perturbation of hormones and body composition has changed. Women are already in that like fatigue state. So we look again about fueling for what you're doing and changing it. This is where we're dropping volume significantly and boosting up the intensity. Because when they have less fuel depleting, the body's already really, really adept at going along and slow just by the natural sex differences in mitochondria from birth. And when I get into talking to a lot of women who are in that transition state and they're like, I'm going to start ultra running, I'm going to start ultra gravel, I'm going to start Ironman. It's like, well, why are we doing this? Because I'm getting slower and this is where my body naturally falls. It's like, you don't have to do that. What we need to do is change your training. If we change your training and match the nutrition for it, then you keep seeing performance gains and you can still do the long stuff, but training that long, slow distance that we have been conditioned to do for so many years because coaching hasn't caught up is the exact opposite of what people should be doing when in that menopause transition.
And it's hard, right? Because people want to do the things they're good at.
I know.
And I struggle with this with people that I work with. I struggle with it even myself as I get older. I'm getting better at going longer. And I need to focus, and I need to have these people focus on doing shorter races. And, John and I talk about this often. A sprint triathlon is not short.
No.
Right? That's a half marathon as far as time wise. And no runner would think that the half marathon is short, right?
Correct.
And so we need to go ultra short and, do hard races for 15 minutes.
Super sprint.
Super sprint.
Be part of the super sprint. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm thankful that super sprint is becoming more popular. And, that's actually one of my top secret things. I think maybe, as I get a little bit older, I'm going to sign up for all the super sprints because all the old people are going long. Right.
I know. It's so true. Right.
I could be a super sprint champion for sure. But if you, like you said, if you train it, you can do it. Our bodies adapt. And you're right. Well, naturally, women and men as we get older want to go longer, right? Because it's easier. I guess we're more successful. Right. So I'm really glad you said that.
But the difference, though, is men age in a linear fashion.
Right.
Women don't. So with the whole perimenopause, postmenopause, this is where we have the biggest body composition and neuromuscular changes. So if women aren't on top of changing from long, slow into doing sprint interval training and plyometrics and lifting heavy, then they're going to get a lot slower, a lot faster, and not see any body composition change because they're not going to get the impetus to build and or maintain lean mass.
Right.
So it's really looking at that transitional aspect where you start doing the interval stuff, and men are about 10 years down the track from that. So yeah.
Oh, I think it's great, but it's, you know, in a few of the perimenopausal, menopausal people I've worked with, it's actually really hard to get them to do that.
I know. And part of it
like
is
an intervention.
right. And part of it also is the mentality. I mean, I'm in my mid to late 40s. And growing up in the era of like the supermodels and Jane Fonda and fat burning and calories in, calories out, not lifting because it'll make you bulky, and not doing high intensity work because it'll, quote, eat your muscle. So those are the mentality things that I fight with my clients, and I fight to teach women that these are all myths. And so you're fighting that mentality that's been so ingrained since we were kids. But I'm thinking that the next cohort of women that come through that are in the peri and postmenopause won't be so hard set into doing the long, slow stuff, because they're now growing up in the era of strong is the new skinny, and you know, lifting is good, doesn't make you bulky. You want to do high intensity work. So there's hope. I have hope. Yeah.
I do too. I do too. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I want to unpack the energy availability a little bit more because energy availability, how do you approach that from pre-training or your regular diet? What happens during training, and then even what happens during recovery? And again, focusing on the female athlete, and whether that's over the menstrual cycle or menopause, premenopause.
Yeah, so when I talk about like fueling for what you're doing, a lot of us get up and we hit the pool at our 6 a.m. session, right? Nobody really wants to eat at 5 or 5:30 in the morning. But I make it a precedence, like you got to get out the door with something in your stomach. It can be a protein fortified coffee where you're putting a scoop of protein powder and milk alternative into your cold brew as you're driving to the pool, or you're having a half a banana, but you're doing something to bring your blood sugar up. And then on the pool deck, you're having some hydration, not a sports drink, but actually hydration to help with that aspect and keep cortisol as low as you can while you're in your session. Then when you get out of the pool, you have about a half an hour to 40 minutes where you want to get some carbohydrate and protein back in, because this is where your body's like, hey, wait, I've just burned through some stuff, and I've been not getting a lot of food for the past 8 or so hours. So I'm hungry for it. I need it now to really start reparation and recovery, refueling. And it's really critical for women to understand that, especially the second session in the evening. And it can be like overnight oats, or can be, you know, hard-boiled eggs that you're eating as you're getting to the office, or if you have the opportunity to go home first and having your breakfast ready, or half of your breakfast ready when you get home. And then you can carry on with your usual lunch, afternoon snack, and then a dinner, right? So you're really trying to book in your calories in and around your training. And super important if you're doing something first thing in the morning, to really make sure you have something in your system, because if you don't, then you're not going to be able to hit those intensities that you want in that morning session, nor are you going to be able to really downturn the catabolic state so much, because you're trying to fight what your body is like, hey, wait, I don't have enough fuel. And here you are in this big stressful situation. And so we start getting peptin perturbants. Early days, we know 4 days of fasted training can really onset low energy availability symptomology. And then if you have a session in the evening, it's like you have your lunch, you have your afternoon snack. And if that afternoon snack is within 2 hours of your evening session, that's fine. But if it's not, then maybe you have half your dinner, a carbohydrate heavy part of your dinner before, and then your protein heavy part after, especially if it's a track session at night, because you want to get some of that carbohydrate in for building up and being able to hit the track session at night, and the protein for reparation. And protein has the least effect on sleep architecture. So if you're eating later at night and it's more protein driven, then we know that it has the least effect on that slow wave sleep. Um, when we talk about how it changes of the menstrual cycle, the timing doesn't really, but it's what are you eating and what are you manipulating across the menstrual cycle. So low hormone, so day one's first day of bleeding all the way through ovulation, your body can use carbohydrate pretty well. So we want to focus a little bit more on protein for recovery and make sure that you're getting carbohydrate on a regular basis to refill glycogen stores. But after ovulation, we have the shift where your body relies more on plasma glucose because estrogen and progesterone really prevent your body from using muscle and liver glycogen. So progesterone breaks down things because its whole goal is to provide building blocks for the endometrial lining. So after ovulation, if you want to hit intensities, you have to have some more carbohydrate on board. So this is where I start telling women you need to have a heavier carbohydrate intake over those 2-ish weeks of the luteal phase to support blood glucose for intensity. Also to help your body try to put more carbohydrate back into the liver and the muscle, and protein because you're already in a catabolic state even at rest. So we start to really look and say, okay, I need to put an emphasis more on carbohydrate every meal matched with some protein. In the follicular phase, you can kind of get away with the normal, whatever normal is. But when you get into that luteal phase to really maximize training and training adaptations, you have to pay a little bit more attention to what that overall intake looks like.
That is great information. Thank you. And maybe I'll dive into a little bit more here because I know you go into in some of your research on different types of carbohydrates to take in, and could you talk about the type of carbohydrate?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm notorious for saying women shouldn't be using maltodextrin and fructose, and that really has to do with a slower gastric emptying rate, slower intestinal absorption, and if you're having the glucose polymer and the fructose sit in the small intestines for a longer period of time, brush border effect, which means increases that osmotic pressure and pulls water from other spaces to dilute that pressure, so you're effectively dehydrating yourself. So when we're looking at what kind of carbohydrates women should have in and around training, we really want to minimize maltodextrin and fructose. We want to look more for glucose and sucrose mixes. And yes, I know sucrose has fructose in it, but it's rate limited because it has to be hydrolyzed and broken down. So it's rate limited and your body can handle that small amount of fructose. We're talking about overall diet. As you get older, you really want to emphasize the fibrous fruit and veg for gut microbiome to help with anxiety, depression, BDNF production, as well as changes in your metabolism that signal more of the cereal fat gain. So we look at carbohydrates coming more from fruit and veg and whole grains rather than some of the quick hits that we see a lot of people using in the endurance sport world.
Oh, that's great. Now, one of our Facebook listeners, they wrote, when you start having your regular diet and you start or eating these foods, how long do you need to say this is a regular diet? You know, is it a day? Is it 6 months? What's
regular?
Yeah, what's regular? That's great.
What's regular? When it becomes a habit. So, we say a regular diet is your normal habits that you can hold for 21 or more days.
Oh.
It takes around 21 days for you to actually get into a habit. So it's starting small, right? So if you're like, I'm not going to use gels anymore, which would make me sing from the top of the hills if no one ever used gels again, then it's like a small step, and that's the first thing you're going to eliminate. And what are you going to replace it with? Maybe it's with some figs, or maybe it's with energy blocks, or maybe it's with your favorite Mike and Ike kind of candy, right? But not gels, because it is that concentrated maltodextrin fructose sit in the gut, cause that osmotic diuresis. And that's a one change, and that will become normal after 3 weeks because you won't even think about it. So it's small little changes that you make to become normal, whatever your normal is.
I love the fact that you mentioned Mike and Ike's because I'm notorious for eating candy when I ride my bike, especially.
Nice.
And I sometimes feel like guilty, right, when I'm riding with other people and like I'm eating jelly beans, and they're having their gels because they're fancy gels, and I'm like, oh gosh, I'm eating jelly beans, and these people are going to judge me, and I'm like, I know I'm doing the right thing. Right?
Yeah. All they have to do. I know.
We live in a society where we're like, oh, you got to have the $2 gel,
and you don't.
And you don't.
No, the way I look at it is like you go to the grocery store and buy one of those canisters of Betty Crocker frosting and put them in individual little sachets, and there's your gel. Because it's pretty much the same shit. Oh, sorry.
No, that's completely fine. But no, I agree. I agree with you. And I'm super fortunate. My wife and I have come up with a recipe for TED cookies
Yeah.
for training. She bakes them for me, and it's great.
Yeah.
And it's like the good things, right? Like it's dates, it's oats, it's coconut, it's real food.
Yeah.
And it's so funny now. I have a Cliff Bar, and I'm like, oh, that's gross.
Right. We can't get them here. Like, well, we can, but I won't buy them because one Cliff Bar is $6. And
Yeah.
I don't really, so I'm like, I don't really like that much to spend $6 on it because how many do I need for a 4 or 5 hour ride, right?
I would eat
And it's
0
like,
of them if they're $6.
right, exactly. So here, I mean, there's a huge, like, what are you eating? And I was like, well, this morning, what did I take with me? I took a banana, I took mixed fruit and nuts, and then I had energy balls, which is pretty much Trek mix that you put into a food processor, blend up and pull it into little balls. And I
Oh.
had coffee beans in it, blended up. So I had like my espresso balls. But you just become like, that's normal. And I go to the States and people are like, here, have a bar. I'm like, oh, what is this? It's just so endemic in the States to use engineered sports nutrition, where everywhere else in the world isn't quite that reliant.
Oh, I love it. But you had me at frosting, so.
Oh, yeah, okay. But then, you could take a TED cookie and then
Yeah.
put some of that frosting on it. And
I
then
have
it's just,
shared them with John before. I got to be honest with you. He's tried one of them.
there you go.
So then what would you suggest for drinking during long training sessions?
I'm all about the functional hydration, and like outside of the Dr. Stacy Sims is very prolific on social media. I started as thermoreg and fluid specialist. So I've done my dash of creating drinks on the market, and looking at seminal research, even some of the stuff that Gatorade started with, and it's a 3 to 4% solution. So you're looking at 3 to 4 grams of glucose sucrose combination per 100 mils. So that's 8-ish grams per 16 ounces.
Yep.
And you want to look for some sodium. So 160 milligrams ish of sodium per 16 ounces, because you really just need some sugar and sodium to pull fluid in. All the other stuff.
I tell my students the same thing all the time. I'm like, it is not that hard.
No.
Right? These are very simple things that we've over-engineered,
right.
And it doesn't have to be hard.
No. And the story I love to tell, and since we're telling stories, I'll tell it here, is when you look at the history of how Gatorade came to be, and we all know the history of, the Florida Gators and the renal physiologist roommate who's like, have some glucose and some salt and some water to help your football players. But when you start reading the research of after it was bought by Quaker Oats, that had an artificial sweetener in it that was then banned by the FDA. So they couldn't put that sweetener in, and they had to take it out. And they're like, oh, what do we do now? We're going to double the carbohydrate, because then that is what makes it palatable. And we'll tell people that we need carbohydrate while we're exercising, and this is the best way to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing to do with fluid absorption.
Right.
It has to do with marketing. And here, again, sports drinks, like you can get a can of goo, one of the small little cans of powdered goo, it's $55. So you're like, oh my gosh, right? And here people are like, I'm going to take some maple syrup and some table salt and put it in a drink bottle and away I go, because you have glucose, sucrose, and some sodium. So people are like, yeah, what am I going to do? And others are like, oh, I'll put some Braro and some salt. So Kool-Aid and some salt, just not quite the same, but people are pretty inventive outside the States, and seems to go pretty well.
We're lucky that, we're lucky and unlucky in the States, because we have things that are relatively cheap like that. But because they're cheap, why would I go and mess around and have to mix up my own thing when I can just
buy
a huge bottle of Gatorade for 99 cents? And
I know.
Yeah.
I will admit I am jealous. I do miss the States. I really do miss the States.
For sure.
Accessibility of stuff is one of those things.
Well, okay, so but you're both talking about how simple this is, but yet, you look at an Ironman event, and the vast majority of the competitors will have some GI problem during the event. Now, that's maybe because they're why is that?
Because people leave the nutrition X factor to being X. They don't really plan it. Or they'll do something like, oh, my coach told me to do this without questioning it. Or Meredith Kessler does this, so I'm going to follow that. And then the aid stations on the course don't look after the athlete. They look after sponsorship dollars, right? So whoever has the biggest amount of money to come in and sponsor the race is what's going to get on the aid station table. It has nothing to do with what's beneficial for the athlete. So many people have GI distress because they follow the marketing. And we know that marketing is stronger than science. So when I push people and say, what is your nutrition plan? We have to dial in the nutrition plan. I even have pros who will dial it in and then default back to what's on the race table and the aid stations and end up with significant GI distress. Like, why did you deviate? Would you switch to somebody's like training wheels on the middle of the bike course if something happened to your bike wheels? Of course you wouldn't. You would try to fix yours, right? Or you would try to get someone to give you another set of race wheels. So why are you leaving that same mentality on the race course when you're grabbing for that gel or grabbing for the Gatorade that's on the table? And people they lose sight. They just lose focus because there's so many mixed messages around nutrition.
Oh, that is powerful. Okay, so then how about a hydration plan if you're racing in one part of a menstrual cycle versus another part?
So when we get into that high hormone phase after ovulation, quite a few things change. Our thirst sensation changes and it becomes muted. So we don't have that drive to drink so much. We have a decrease in our plasma osmolality. So we sit closer to that hyponatremic, clinical hyponatremic state, and our body kicks out more total body sodium. But the interesting thing is there's sex differences in blood sodium levels at the end of a race. So if you were to take age and fitness match men and women, have them do the same race, they finish around the same time. Men will finish with normal to high blood sodium levels. Women will finish primarily with normal to slightly low blood sodium levels. So when we talk about sodium and salt tablets, it makes me cringe again because no one needs them. Women might need them if they've experienced hyponatremia and they are just drinking plain water. But if you're eating and drinking stuff with sodium in it, then that's your sodium needs taken care of. And when you're hydrating in the high hormone phase, it's remembering to sip on a regular basis, not go, oh, I need to drink so much per hour. I forgot to drink and gulp it down. You need to sip at a regular basis. And I kind of tell people to do that across the board, but it's really important in the high hormone phase to do that.
Interesting. We get it's once again the marketing, right? We got to have salt. We got to have salt. We got to have salt. And and it scares people, right? We've actually had cramping experts on our on this podcast as well, and it's the same message they're giving us. Is like, it's not solving your cramping issues. It's not solving your gastrointestinal issues. You're doing it because you're being marketed to.
Right.
And
to solve your gastro issues and your cramping is if you didn't use gels and sports drinks. If you dialed in your nutrition, you wouldn't have all these problems.
No, it's so true. And oftentimes with the people I work with, we talk about even like, just can you fix your gut first, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's start at the very basis of your physiology, and that's bringing energy in to your system. And can we do that in a healthy way? And then let's talk about your interval training. And no, we want to talk about interval training. What interval should I do today? Let's talk about your GI.
Yeah, I know. Have you guys done much with creatine at all?
I actually used creatine last year during our COVID year quite consistently, and actually had some pretty good results. And then I stopped using it over the winter break last year, and I was like, oh my gosh! And now I'm talking to you, I should start back up again, because actually I got some good results with it. Yeah,
it's only a 3 to 5 gram dose stirred in your coffee in the morning, but it's outside of the performance issue, especially for women, it maintains that mucosal integrity in the gut, so it really helps eliminate gut issues. Helps with brain and cognition. And so if you're on the race course and you're like, tight turn, what am I going to do, right? So creatine shows to help with that. And then you have the performance benefits of, if you're doing a low dose, you don't get the subsequent weight gain, you just get improved strength and power performance. So I'm like, everyone in the world should be taking creatine, especially if you're a vegetarian.
No, it's so funny. You get to the point where you go on a vacation and then your supplements change. It's so weird.
I know.
I come back and I'm like, what was I doing again? Oh, yeah.
Line them up on the shelf before you leave, and then you come back, you're like, what was I doing with that one? I can't remember.
And that's my problem, because I actually, I've cycled in and out of lots of things. I read things. I'm like, I should try that. And I need a spreadsheet of this does this. and this is why you do this.
Yeah.
And I'm never disciplined enough to do that though, but maybe you've inspired me to do that.
Yeah. But for men, there's a long list in that spreadsheet. For women, it's very small,
Yeah.
very, very small. So you look for women, creatine, maybe some beta alanine, vitamin D, and then on occasion, if you're like low on iron, then you're doing iron supplementation every other day during the low hormone phase. And that's pretty much it.
Have you seen success with beta alanine and the nitric oxide stimulants or stimulators?
I have in older women. So when you start getting that perimenopause, postmenopause, and you have a lot of endothelial dysfunction, the beta alanine helps because estrogen's so tied to the nitric oxide cycle.
Right.
In younger women, not so much. You get a lot of the tingling, but no real performance benefit. Kate Wickham, PhD student with Stephen Chung up at Rock. She did a really fantastic review paper on nitric oxide in women versus men, and there's actually no performance benefit for women to use it.
Right, and that's what I've been seeing. And
yeah,
interesting. So, but older women, we should give that a go.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, I want to back up just a bit because I'm monitoring Facebook and I do see a comment on creatine for endurance. And usually when you hear people talk about creatine, they are talking about for strength gain. So maybe talk just a little bit more about how creatine is beneficial for endurance training and/or events.
Yeah. So creatine, well, for starters, women have 70% less storage than men. So for just a starting point, women need to consider it for all things bioenergetic. We also know that creatine is really essential for all those fast energetics in the body. So it's your intestines, it's your brain, it's reaction time. And we're talking about endurance, you're pushing power on the bike, right? So when you're going up a hill, that's like doing a leg press, and you want to be able to maintain that neuromuscular power. And if you have creatine on board, it helps boost that, especially in training. So if we're looking for that training effect to then translate into performance effect, then having a little bit of extra creatine on board helps you build that power. And of course, we know how well it works in the gym when you're pushing that kind of stuff. But if you're translating it into endurance and endurance power, it helps significantly there in endurance sport as well.
Interesting. So I've got a race this weekend. Do I add creatine to my drink?
How many days do you have left? Do you have the opportunity to load? A quick 2-day load?
I think I got 3 days now, right?
You can. You totally can. You could do a 2-day load.
Oh,
Totally.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to give that a shot. Okay, so now that reminds me that you've done some work in the salt world in terms of taking salt prior to events or prior to exercise. Maybe talk a little bit about the importance, if it matters, whether or not you should be taking in salt, a high amount of salt before an event.
Yeah, so this is where things get a little bit confusing in the messaging. So I did my PhD in plasma volume expansion. So I took an idea from NASA about using sodium and fluid to expand plasma volume. And that's where everyone's like, oh, salt loading. It's like, no, it's a sodium and fluid load. So if we're bringing in more sodium with matching fluid, then you get more plasma volume. If we have more plasma volume, then we have better availability of blood circulation and sweating. So when we talk about doing a preload or a hyperhydration drink before a big event, it can be something like miso or chicken soup the night before. Or if you're looking at doing one of the products that are on the market, you can use a preload, but it's about boosting that blood volume, that plasma volume, because with sodium, you need fluid for that expansion. And then in the later stages of the race, you have more total body sodium on board, which again, then helps equilibrate some of those fluid fluctuations that happens with ultra endurance.
Oh, I love it. This is good. All right. So,
so before your race, this hot race this weekend, 2 days of creatine loading and then chicken soup the night before.
Okay, and I've actually been doing some high salt loading before, so this is affirmation. I love it. So, but now I like the chicken soup, and I'm going to put creatine in my frosting. So,
okay,
I'm building up on it.
Perfect. Put it on your Ted cookie and away you go.
Exactly. All cookies.
All right, so we're talking about a lot of different things. But how about even the older athlete? Obviously there's going to be crossing into menopausal, but the 50s, 60s, 70s, and we're seeing people in their 80s even exercise. How does that all sort of change the perspective of or does it at all?
Well, with age, there's definitely both men and women, there's a change in metabolism and what you need, right? So we know when we get past that menopausal transition and we're into post-menopause, and we start aging linearly like men. So both men and women really need to up their protein gain. So we talk about, like, you'll see studies that say anything over 25 grams of protein doesn't really affect muscle protein synthesis
Mm,
in older individuals because the dosage isn't high enough. We don't see anything until you hit that 40-gram mark. And people are really afraid of protein because of potential kidney problems, which we know isn't true. I don't want to get bulky, which we know isn't true. But the older you get, the more emphasis you need on that protein. And also multi-directional training. So jump training, multi-directional stress for bone. So as we get older, those are the two big concerns to be able to maintain lean mass and strength and maintain our skeletal integrity. With regards to other types of training, both as you age as a man and as a woman, you need to start polarizing your training. So you're
mm,
doing more high intensity, less volume, because we know that the body responds really well to volume and becomes slower and slower. But if we want to maintain performance, we want to maintain neuromuscular integrity, we have to look at that polarized where we're doing opposite of what Steven says. We want 80% high intensity, 20% volume, where
mm,
Steven Seller is like 20%, 80%. So
mhm,
as you get older, you flip it around.
mm. Oh, that's great. Okay, so that even leads into the strength training issue. And I'm going to ask you a question because my wife asked for it. So,
Okay.
what are the 5 most important strength training moves for an endurance athlete and even a menopausal endurance triathlete?
So I always look at posterior chain because if you see most people running off the bike, they're like in this jackknife, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because their core is weak, their quads are dominant, and they don't have glute muscles. And women are quad dominant anyway. So we want to look at deadlifts. We want to look at Romanian deadlifts, single leg split squats, a lot of rotational core work, balance work. So those are, is that 5? Can we count that as 5? Right? So anything that's like
We'll
um,
count them later.
spinal, core, posterior chain, balance, and for women, really working the glutes and the
Yeah,
hamstrings.
yeah. Interesting. Okay, so then if you do this high intensity stuff, obviously the recovery has to come into play here. And we have a question here on, is the 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 carb to protein ratio too many carbs during recovery?
So 3-to-1 is for premenopausal women. We want to look more for 2-to-1 in the peri and postmenopausal women. And 4-to-1 is good for men up to around age 60, 65. And then you want to start looking at that 3-to-1. Because it's that ratio of we want to increase the protein versus the carbohydrate. You still need carbohydrate for recovery because it does help with muscle glycogen and repair and dropping cortisol, but putting that emphasis on protein and dropping the amount of carbs as you get older.
I have one more question for you, and it's going to go back to the we just talked about with the protein. So protein is another area where you have to battle people.
Always, always.
And even my wife, I'm like, you have to, she's in her 40s, 30 grams per meal, every meal. Oh, I just can't eat that much. I'm like, I don't care. Shove it in,
Yeah,
in you.
get in there.
It is so good for you. And how do we get past this? Or how have you been successful at getting past it, or have you?
So I end up quoting a lot of studies, right?
Yeah.
And we know that because of the whole energy balance stuff I'm in and working with women who are like, I want to change my body composition. I'm like, you have high protein, then you could be in a calorie deficit and you won't get low energy availability symptomology and you won't lose your lean mass. And the other thing, especially if a wife's in her 40s, it's really effing difficult to build mass when you get into your 40s. So she's not taking care of it and bringing protein in to maintain and or build now. Like she could go do really heavy deadlifts till the cows come home when she's 48, 49, and she won't build mass. She'll get strength, but she won't build mass. So now's the time to nail it in. And I always approach women, it's like, what do you want to do when you're 80? Do you want to just be frail sitting on the couch and you don't have enough muscle mass? So like do push-ups against the wall? And nobody wants that. I was like, well, you have to take care of your muscle mass now. And the way you do that is feeding it regular amino acids. Or if they're suffering from anxiety and depression and mood disorder, they're like, you need to have more leucine on board to kick out that tryptophan so that you have more stable moods.
Yep.
So approach it a couple of different ways.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I feel like I've been yelling from the mountaintops for years about this. And it's just, once again, it's endemic in our society that, too much protein is not good. And then, quality of protein. I know you've talked a lot about that in other places, and getting the branched chain amino acids, in particular, high amounts of leucine, and it's not that hard. It really isn't.
Yeah.
And especially when it becomes a habit, like we talked about, you get that, you get the habit of the 21 days or a month. But man, it's an uphill battle.
It is. Start small and work your way up, right?
Exactly.
I feel like your wife should talk to my husband, because my husband's kind of like,
And the best part is I cook. Like, I do the cooking. She makes the cooking. She bakes. I cook. And there's always protein in every meal, and it's just like a battle to shove it in.
But she doesn't have an excuse. She's not doing the cooking. You're presenting her with the meal.
I know, but then she'll only eat like half.
She's
like,
oh my gosh.
I'm like, eat the whole thing. It's 5 ounces of meat, please. It's
good. It's good. It'll help you. Yeah.
Oh, this is great. Well, Stacy, we've kept you an hour, and that's what we wanted to. And we want to thank you so much for your time. This was wonderful.
Yeah, no worries.
I love having conversations with intelligent people like yourself. And this was, once again, the best hour of my week. So.
I hope we're all not angry now. I'm not. I've had a great time. It's been fun. Thanks.
I had a great time, and I have a half a bottle of creatine. John, maybe I'll send it over your way.
Well, actually, my son started using it, so I'm going to go steal a couple of his capsules and open them up. So
there you go. Perfect. Let's see how you go.
I do have one last question. What is on your exercise agenda for the weekend?
Oh, unfortunately, it's supposed to start pouring with rain, and so I'm going to go swim in the ocean tomorrow morning.
Oh, nice.
But we have to have lifeguards and boats, because there have been some great white shark sightings. So I'm going to be safe when I do my ocean swim. Oh. And then on Sunday, we have a trail run planned.
Very nice.
Yeah. Well, and I know what you're doing. What are you doing, Ted?
A long run, long swim, long bike. It's a typical weekend for me. Actually, it's supposed to be beautiful here again, like 75, 80 degrees. And
nice.
And really, it's very rare in Vegas in December that we have weather like that. So definitely just get out and
enjoy it. Yeah, perfect.
Well, we've both been to New Zealand. We're both trying to get back to New Zealand. So hopefully, when the 70.3 world champs or the world opens up again, we can get back there. But if you ever do come to Vegas, we are going to make you an honorary Las Vegas Triathlon Club member.
Perfect.
So
thanks.
We'll help you out if you come through Vegas.
Perfect. And would you guys come to Taupo, or would you go down to Wanaka?
To Taupo is what we're both shooting for that 2024 World Championship now. We were both going to be there. When was it originally? 2021?
I don't remember.
November. November.
Yeah.
And then it was the 2023, 2022, 2023, and we just keep getting it pushed off. But it's both of us really want to come back and do that race. And
cool. Bring your mountain bike too, because there's fantastic mountain biking in Taupo.
Are you crazy? You've made the flight. Try and bring 2 bikes.
I know. You can. You ship it with bike flight, and that way it's here. You fly with your race bike and you ship your mountain bike.
Or just rent a mountain bike, right? Maybe
you could do that too. Totally. Yeah. I'll take you around, because we're about an hour and a half away from Taupo.
Yeah.
Awesome. That sounds fabulous.
Yeah.
This has been so much fun. Thank you so much. And packed with information. This is really good.
You're welcome. Well, have a good weekend and good luck with your race.
Yeah, thank you. It'll be fun. Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone who was listening.